Hi, I'm Christopher Ray, and welcome to the first of 3 video lectures about Qian Zhongshu's novel Fortress Besieged. This novel is a personal favorite. I first read it in graduate school, and I was surprised and delighted at how different it was from all the other modern Chinese literary works I had read up to that point. It was witty, it was humorous, it was tremendously complex, and it even inspired me to go on to write a whole book about modern Chinese humor. So Qian Zhongshu has been a very influential author in my own personal life, and so I'm delighted to be talking about this work, which I think bears reading and rereading. If you're curious to learn more about Qian Zhongshu, I also made a brief video lecture about his life and works. In this video lecture, I want to talk about the novel as a wartime novel. This is a novel that was written during war, it is set during a war, and so it begs questions about, well, is this a novel just about war? Or is it about other things as well? First, I'll talk about when, where, and how the novel was written. Then we'll talk about which war are we referring to here. This is a war by many names. And then what was Qian Zhongshu, the author, doing during wartime? Finally, I want to talk about how the novel represents the war itself, because I think it does so in a way very different from many other authors who try to show what were the frontline battles like. How did the war directly impact people? We have a novel that is set during war, but a lot of the action seems a little bit divorced from or removed from the frontline conflict and the headlines of the day. Fortress Besieged is a novel that has a tremendously high reputation both in China and abroad. The influential critic C.T. Xia referred to it as the most delightful and carefully wrought novel in modern Chinese literature. It is perhaps also its greatest novel. This is high praise indeed, and it begs the question, well, what is so outstanding about this particular work? This is a novel not just of war, but also of a marriage. And we know this partly because not just of its plot, but because of some of the discourse surrounding the novel. In particular, this long essay written by Qian Zhongshu's wife, Yang Zhang. This was an essay she wrote in the 1980s when Qian was being rediscovered by a whole new generation of Chinese readers who were curious about who was this remarkable writer who wrote this remarkable work. And so she wrote a little bit about who Qian Zhongshu was and how we should interpret the novel. She provides a lot of insights about the characters in the novel and also how Qian Zhongshu wrote it. And she also highlights her own role as his first reader and someone who supported him through the writing process. This entire essay has been translated by Jesse Field, and it is well worth reading. For example, Yang Zhang reveals in this essay that the character of Zhao Xinmei was inspired by a little boy, and Qian Zhongshu just added 20 years to his age. Qian Zhongshu became famous for his novel in the 1980s, but then he was really rocketed into the stratosphere of literary celebrity by this 1990 television serial adaptation of the novel that stars a couple of famous actors, Chen Daoming, who plays Fang Hongjian, and Ge You, who plays Li Meiting. You may recognize Ge You from many of the films by Feng Xiaogang, he's a famous comedian, and Chen Daoming plays the King of Qin, later the first emperor of China, in Zhang Yimou's film Hero. Fortress Besieged is a novel with a famous epigraph. Here's the English version. Marriage is like a fortress besieged. Those on the outside want to get in, and those on the inside want to get out. We can see in this epigraph a long-standing practice of likening marriage to a battlefield or a war between the sexes, but this is a novel written during an actual war, and it links this long-standing, somewhat cliched trope to a Chinese motif, the Weicheng, or the fortress besieged. This novel is set during a war that was declared in July 1937. That month is actually mentioned in the first page of the novel. But China had been in a state of war with Japan, an undeclared war, since 1931. There had been many successive invasions, bombings, military conflicts in the preceding decade. In 1945, Japan was defeated by the Allies, and a state of civil war then resumed between the nationalists and the communists, which was eventually settled in the communists' favor. So the publication context of the novel, too, is also one of war. This is a war of several names. It's most commonly known as the War of Resistance against Japan, or the Anti-Japanese War. It's sometimes also referred to as the Second Sino-Japanese War, since there had been a war between the Qing Empire and the Empire of Japan in the 1890s. It used to be known as the 8-Year Resistance War. This is how it was referred to back in the 1940s, but it has since been reinterpreted by the contemporary Chinese government as a 14-year war of resistance, dating from 1931. It is sometimes also referred to as China's World War II, although that terminology obscures a lot of things, including the fact that the time of war, the duration of war in China, was very, very different. If you're interested in learning more about the conflict, these are 2 histories that I think are well worth reading, and Hans van de Vens in particular makes the case that the war between China and Japan and the war between the communists and the nationalists, really from a civilian's perspective and from a military perspective, was one continuous conflict. You can also read social histories of war by the historian Diana Larry, focusing on both the anti-Japanese war and the Civil War. But what are the social effects of the war on the characters in the novel? Well, the initial effects for Fang Hongjian are quite positive. He is now the prestigious Dr. Fang, foreign educated, returned to China. He's going to share his wisdom with the locals and bring glory to his family and the prestige of his father and the like. So he addresses this school, but he's forgotten his speech. And so he improvises disastrously, saying that opium and syphilis are the two things that the West has given to China as a cultural inheritance. And before the day was over, many people had learned that Fang's son, just returned from study abroad, publicly advocated smoking opium and visiting brothels. The fighting at Wusong on August 13th, 1937 occurred soon afterwards, and Fang Hongjian's prank was mentioned no more, much to the relief of his father and Fang himself. Fang is also delighted by this outcome because his mother and other family members have been trying to set him up with a local girl, but he's not so eager to get married just yet. Much of this novel is set in the city of Shanghai. So Japan had bombed and invaded Shanghai in 1937 at the end of the year, and essentially the city had been under occupation since December all the way until the end of the war in 1945. However, the occupation was really split into two parts. The first part was from when Japan invaded Shanghai and bombed it in late 1937 and won a battle against the Chinese forces, driving them out before proceeding on to Nanjing. After that attack, Japan set up an occupation authority, but it controlled only the so-called Chinese city because a lot of the foreign powers were still neutral. So there were these big swaths of the city known as the foreign concessions. And so this safe space became known as the Orphan Island. So after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the entire city fell under Japanese occupation, and circumstances changed dramatically yet again. Qian Zhongshu's personal trajectory during the war began with a boat ride home in 1938 from Europe to China, and then he went directly into the interior. He had been recruited to be a professor at his alma mater, Tsinghua University. However, Tsinghua had been forced down from Beijing into Yunnan province, where they formed an amalgamated university, Southwestern United University. So Qian Zhongshu taught there for a time. He then returned to Shanghai briefly to be reunited with his wife and daughter before going back into the interior in Hunan province to teach at a college that some people have likened to Sanlu University or speculated was the inspiration for that fictional university in the novel. During this time, particularly in the late 1930s when he was down in Yunnan, Qian Zhongshu wrote a series of essays which Yang Zhang later collected into Written in the Margins of Life. This is a particularly interesting collection if you want to understand what Qian Zhongshu is about, and it can also provide some insights into Fortress Besieged, as I'll discuss in a later video lecture. So just to briefly show where Qian Zhongshu was, there you have Yunnan province in the southwest, Hunan in kind of the central south, and Shanghai over on the eastern coast. Qian Zhongshu moved to Shanghai in 1941. He was reunited with Yang Jiang, with their daughter, with other family members. Both of them did a lot of creative writing. Both of them took teaching jobs and tutoring jobs in order to make ends meet. And during most of this time, Shanghai was under complete Japanese occupation. And Yang Zhang has written many memoirs talking about some of the indignities and some of the privations that they suffered during this time. Yang Zhang also played a particularly crucial role in the composition of Fortress Besieged because she supported the family while Qian Zhongshu was writing his novel 500 words a day for about 2 years. Yang Zhang had been invited to write a play by a couple of influential playwrights, and she ended up writing 3 comedies, all comedies of manners about kind of upper-class people, particularly in Shanghai. And these were rapturously received by the public in Shanghai and brought in much-needed income for the family. And she even recounts that Qian Zhongshu watched one of these stagings, and this inspired him to write the novel. Now, just what writers and artists should be doing during the war was very controversial. There was a lot of pressure nationwide to produce propaganda to advocate for anti-Japanese resistance, and many writers and artists chose that path. Qian Zhongshu, however, did not. Much later, in an interview with the scholar Ted Hooters, who wrote a biography of Qian Zhongshu, he said that his goal with Fortress Besieged was to represent the war of resistance against Japan as being at once remote and impinging, like the Napoleonic Wars in the novels of Jane Austen. Chen also tries to capture some of the mentality of people during war and with an impinging war. So August 1937, Fang Hongjian is going back to his hometown, and the narrator describes how people in that locale were responding to news of war. So at first, people are totally unconcerned because the last time there was a major conflict, it hadn't really affected them directly, so nobody was too alarmed. Of course, eventually the war does end up at their doorstep. I would also draw attention to how the narrator represents the war from an ironic and even literary distance, where things are interpreted through a literary allusion, and they're not described in detail. Literary scholars have identified a shared sensibility between Qian Zhongshu and another writer of 1940s Shanghai, Ailing Zhang or Zhang Ailing. Both of them represented the war from a little bit of a distance. They wrote a lot about the everyday, they wrote a lot about character psychology, and just to give one example from one of Ailing Zhang's most famous stories, in Sealed Off, or Blockade, we have a story where two people meet on a tram. They're both just commuting back home. It's a normal day under Japanese occupation, when suddenly the occupation authorities seal off part of the city. And so this tram has to come to a halt. There's a military action, a manhunt going on, and this is just an inconvenience for these travelers. And so what do? This kind of cosmic void or existential void has opened up, and people try desperately to fill the time. And some of them even indulge in fantasy love affairs. They strike up a conversation and start planning their future together. This young English teacher and a married man. Is he going to leave his wife? So all of these fantasies and imaginings occur in this time. And then ding, 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 the blockade is lifted, the tram continues on its way. And this question we're left with is, what has been the meaning of what just happened during that special time and place, during that entrapment? And has anything changed in the big picture? And what can we learn about human beings from what has happened at that moment? So for now, I'll leave you with this question, which I believe is implicit in Qian Zhongshu's novel, about does anything change fundamentally during war? Does human nature change? If so, how much? Or does war just magnify things that already exist in who we are?